Hi, I'm Karin Holley. I'm a certified leadership and mindset coach supporting high achieving educators to improve their performance, their well being, and their relationships. And this is my Authentic Pathways interview series where I talk with educational leaders and professionals whom I find inspiring and are leading lives that are true to who they are and their values. Today I'm speaking with Ross Wehner about what purpose means for leadership. And Russ will share the theory and science of purpose and what it means for leading and working in a school. And Russ starts from the premise that leaders are successful not only because of their skills and experience, but also because of their human presence. And I couldn't agree more, which is why I've asked him to join me today. He sees leaders really as humans with beating hearts who can bring their whole selves to work every day. And it really isn't about perfection, but it is about being deeply human. And so these leaders need to manage this careful fit between who they are on the inside, their essence, which is something that we also work on in coaching, and then how they show up in the world. And when we have that fit between their essence and how they're showing up in this outside world, we can be transparent and inspire trust and be more resilient, according to Ross. So, Ross, you're a writer, a social entrepreneur, and founder of the World Leadership School, which partners with K-12 schools to reimagine learning and create next generation leaders. You've also founded the nonprofit K-12 Change Lab, which helps schools organize strategic goals. And your guiding question is, how can K-12 schools become the ultimate platforms for launching students into lives of purpose? You also facilitate the Salmon River Program for school heads, which is a leadership development program that begins with a rafting adventure on the Salmon River in Idaho. And you are also a frequent keynote speaker on the future of K-12 learning. And your TEDx talk, which I've watched numerous times and I find really inspirational, highly recommend. What if the purpose of school were purpose? Was actually recently selected by the TED platform and has received over 275,000 views. So you've done so much, Ross, and I am honored to have you here with us today. I would love to start with how you found your purpose and starting a little bit with your early career. I know you were a journalist and then ending up to working in education and starting all these programs that you have and coming to this purpose of bringing purpose to schools.
Sure. Well, thank you, Karen. It's wonderful to be here. I would love to talk a little bit about my own story, but I first want to just provide a framework that I hope the listeners will find useful. It comes from David Brooks' book, Second Mountain. David Brooks is a op-ed writer for the New York Times. And in this book, Second Mountain, he describes how many people have this like two mountain shape to their lives. In school, we learn to get the grades to achieve and perform. And then we go to university and we get the grades and we achieve and we perform. And then we enter the workforce and we make the same path of achieving and performing. And we start climbing this mountain of achievement. And at some point, David Brooks says in his book, we reach the summit of that mountain. Maybe we become a partner at a law firm, or we sell a business that we started, or whatever the summit is that we've been aspiring for. And we get to that summit and it's not nearly as fulfilling as we thought it was. It's sort of a shallow victory. We feel disappointed by having arrived. And Brooks says that those who have enough vigor left in their lives will descend from that first mountain, wander around in a valley of disappointment and disillusionment, and eventually find a second mountain of meaning by actually doing something in their lives that they find meaningful and fulfilling. And they start climbing the second mountain, and maybe it's no longer about making money or about achieving or impressing one's peers or following parents' expectations, but now it comes from this deeper sense of meaning that a person feels. And it's that second mountain, Brooks says, where people find fulfillment. I find that framework interesting because I think most humans that go through our current school system experience this. And I think it's especially germane to people of my age, sort of from my generation. People were born in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. In terms of my own life, went to a public high school in the United States near Washington, D.C. I went to the University of Virginia. I was an excellent student. I got a job right out of college working for a newspaper. Life was going great until one morning I woke up with this deep sense of dread, anxiety. I think what I was feeling at the time when I was 21 years old is this all there is to life? Is this what my life is going to be forever? And I entered this period of deep existential dread. And after a few months, I eventually decided to quit everything, sell my car, quit my job, and say goodbye to my family. I went to Latin America to work as a journalist. I went to Chile, which in the late 80s was coming out of the Pinochet government, who was a dictator, 17-year dictator in Chile. During that year in Chile, I covered human rights abuses. I interviewed mothers who had lost their children to political violence. I went there not speaking Spanish. I learned Spanish. I went there without a job, without a place to live. I sort of figured it all out. It was a very difficult year. I never felt more depressed or lonely in my life. But it was that year that I actually began to live my own life, that I stepped into my own story. And that single move has made all the difference in my life. I ended up being a journalist in Latin America for another 5 years. I did return to the United States, tired from all the fighting and all the negativity and all the things that I was covering. I spent a lot of time in Peru during the 90s, which was a time of intense political violence and instability from Shining Path, which was a Maoist insurgency that was threatening the country's stability. And I came back to the United States deciding that I no longer wanted to investigate problems. I wanted to find solutions. I began working as a teacher. I got a master's. I worked as a classroom teacher at 3 different schools. I worked as a NOLS instructor, as a wilderness instructor, leading backpacking trips for teenagers for 2 years. And then I started World Leadership School. And the idea was that I wanted to start an organization that could help schools become a platform for purpose. I've been doing this work now for 20 years. The organization has grown, but our mission really remains the same, to partner with K through 12 schools to reimagine learning and create next generation leaders.
Mm. Thank you for that. It's interesting. You talked about your generation really finding or trying to find that second mountain, but you did it at the age of 21. Other people do it maybe in their like early 30s when they finished uni and they have their first job, and you did it really early on, having this idea of what is the meaning of my life, what is the purpose I have. And I'm wondering what sparked that.
Yeah. I think for me, I was very fortunate to have studied German at university, and I got very interested in philosophy, particularly the existentialist philosophers from Europe. And I was so interested in Friedrich Nietzsche that I actually learned German to read Nietzsche in the original. My readings of existential philosophy helped me understand that I didn't need to play anyone's game. It helped me understand that there's a system around me that is making constant demands on me, and that I needed to actually live for myself. And it was very, very difficult because that meant for me breaking from the culture of my own family. My parents were deeply disappointed in my decision to go to Latin America. They were deeply opposed to it. But when I came back, 5 or 6 years later from Latin America, I was then able to fully reintegrate with my own both family and national culture under my own terms. And I've lived in the United States ever since. And I have a wonderful relationship with my family now. So I think for me, it was almost like a philosophical realization. When I do work with high school students, we have this experience called the Youth Purpose Summit, which is a workshop that allows students to get outside themselves and see their deepest gifts, right? Because this purpose work really is an act of faith. The purpose has all kinds of overlays with spirituality. But when I talk about faith and purpose, it's really just this idea is that purpose is the idea that we need to have the faith that there is something about us, there's something about each one of us that is truly magical and wondrous and powerful. And the systems around us are constantly trying to, not intentionally, but the systems are like covering us in dust. They are making us opaque. They're kind of like shutting down our power. And and so this work is about having the faith that there is something magical and wondrous, that we have a story that we can build that will help us become more alive and creative and expressive. And for teachers, this movement of faith is even more powerful. It's this idea that there is something magical and wondrous about each and every child that we teach, and that our job is helping that child see it and unlock it. And so, what I say to children when we do this work with the Youth Purpose Summit, we put words to our gifts, we tell stories to understand how we're using those gifts to have impact. We write a purpose statement, and then they actually map their purpose statement. They create a series of actions and commitments around this purpose statement. And at the end of this workshop, I explain this idea of the second mountain to students. And I say, look, this two mountain shape exists. It happens for many people. But I want you to know that you do not have to climb two mountains. I want you to climb one mountain, and that journey can start right now. And I hope the message sticks for many of the students I work with.
That's beautiful. But as you say, it does take an act of courage or a leap of faith, and sometimes big risks or alienation of your community to really follow your purpose. But at the same time, I sense such empowerment by doing that. You make the choices independent of the systems around you, and do not let those systems dictate. And Russ, what would you say if you look at schools now? Because I'm having lots of conversations with people about this, and a lot of people say that educational system needs to be fixed, like it's broken, it's like cracking at the seams, right? What is the difference between what you're trying to do with compared to this old system?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to school reform. I do not believe that any kind of a massive revolution in education is going to happen. If you look at the history of the last 200 years of school reform, what we find is that there are incremental changes, slow incremental changes. So that's my goal, really, is to help schools make small incremental changes towards their vision of what they want education to be. I think that the most wicked problems in our world are typically the result of two competing polarities. And when you think about the science of polarity thinking or polarity management, essentially what leaders who are used to working with polarities know is that the idea of a polarity is that two things have to be true at the same time, two opposite things. And that to manage a dilemma or a polarity, we actually have to balance these two polarities. We have to manage them in such a way that we experience the benefits of both polarities. If we go too far to one extreme or the other, then we experience the downside of both polarities. And I mention this because purpose itself is a polarity. And the polarity is essentially that the system, like we all live in systems, we are never going to get away from this. Our family is a powerful system. Our schools are a powerful system. Our workplaces are powerful systems. Our nations are powerful systems, right? Our own culture, our sense of ethnicity is a powerful system. And so the work of purpose is we need to comply or meet with the demands of the system. And within that system, we also have to find our own path. Like we need to be doing two things at once. We need to be working with the system and following our own path. And if we can start developing those muscles at an early age, like in middle school, like when a child is 12, 13, 14 years old, what happens is that children begin to understand that they can negotiate with the system and follow their own path. And over time, they can make those two things match up. And what the system is asking us and what we feel called to do as a person, when those things match up, that's when our true power explodes. That's when we learn deeply. That's when we feel a sense of flow and thriving. And so that's the work of purpose. It's not to be on your own, just following your path of purpose, is to figure out both things at the same time. And I think the reason why I had such an existential crisis in my early 20s is that I had never known how to do that. And so suddenly I had to go from just following the system, playing someone else's game, to then completely following my own game. And then over time, I was able to reintegrate those two things, right, into the life that I have now. But what would it be like if we help students do this both and? And so when I think about school itself, people who say, oh, we need to get rid of the industrial model of learning and we need to move to the student-centered mode of learning that's radical. And it's achievable, certainly, in very small startup schools, very specialty schools, niche schools that serve niche student populations. But when we think about the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of children who are educated in schools, I think that we need to adjust to the reality that there is going to be content and standards always in schools. And we need to find ways that within the systems that we have to help students connect with what feels meaningful in learning. Like, we need to do both those things at the same time, right? So it's actually more complex. And I think when people talk about the industrial model of learning, I think it's unfair to history, because there have been many, many waves of reform over even the last 50 years that have made meaningful improvements to school.
Well, I love the nuance that you bring. And we've just talked about the importance of bringing purpose for students and doing that early on so that they can develop these muscles and maybe only climb one mountain. What does purpose then have to do with school leadership?
Yeah. Well, I just got off the Salmon River last week with 24 heads of school. It's an unusual leadership program. Years ago, I used to be an executive coach for Fortune 50 leaders. And I took that work that I learned working with these Fortune 50 leaders, and I've now brought that leadership work to schools, right? And this program is 5 days on the Salmon River, which is an 85-mile wilderness river. It's the longest free-flowing river in the continental United States. During the 5 days, we camp, we navigate class 3 and class 4 rapids. We have learning sessions in the morning. We have reflections around the campfire in the evening. And we build community on the river, this deep, human, vulnerable community that then allows us to have a series of virtual calls during the school year where heads can bring a dilemma that they're facing and they receive support from their peers. This is the 4th year we've been doing it. And I have another Salmon program next week that I'm going on. The reason I mention this is that this program is really resonating with leaders. Leaders are finding that, if you think about the polarity of leadership, as the polarity that I see with leaders is that you need to be strategic, tactical, needs to understand finance, admissions, enrollment, HR, operations, fundraising. Like, they need to have all these technical skills, right? They need to be very skillful. And at the same time, they need to be deeply human. They need to be able to stay human even when things get very, very challenging. And as Brene Brown describes vulnerability, she says vulnerability is not like faux tears, right? It's not like crying or showing emotion or anything. No, vulnerability is about staying open, allowing people to see you, especially when things get tough, and avoiding that temptation to like armor up, right? And so it's like staying open. So it's this polarity. I need to be like tactical and human at the same time. And so what we see is that with heads of school, and I would say emerging leaders in schools as well, we receive all this training on the tactical side, how to look at market demographics, et cetera, but very, very little training on the human side, which is incredible because schools are the most human enterprise of any enterprise, I think, that's ever existed. Schools are about humans helping other humans become human. That's what we do. And you talk to any parent about what are their deepest aspirations for their child, and at the end of the day, they will say, I just want my child to be happy and live a meaningful life. You talk to any teacher about what is their aspiration for every child. It's not that they get a 5 on the AP calculus test. It's that they enjoy learning and they go on and find a sense of meaning in learning. And I think what makes school so interesting is, I have been an entrepreneur. I've managed different companies. I've worked with Fortune 50 leaders. And what I see is that my personal belief is that the head of school has more influence over the enterprise than any other leader. Like a CEO of a large corporation does not have as much influence over her corporation as a head of school would have over her school, right? And that is like crystal clear to me. The head of school is very important. If you want to get something done in a school, you have to have the head of school support. And so, that's why I choose to spend a lot of my time and effort working with heads of school.
And then what does that have to do with the purpose of the heads of school or these emerging leaders, their own purpose? Because you
Yeah.
talk about that as well, right? Thinking about if students need to do it, I'm assuming then the leaders need to do the work as well and have
Yes.
it crystal clear, not only to work towards the mission and the vision of the school, but also why are they in this work? What is their purpose here?
That's right. Well, I think what happens is that with heads of school, like with leaders in general, is that we fail to manage the polarity properly. What I mean by that is, over the last 5 years of world history, we've had COVID, we've had a racial reckoning that's reached around the world. We have had the rise of artificial intelligence. We've had all of these disruptions, right? And the system has made intense demands on the leader. And the leader has been forced to comply with those demands and meet those demands. And by meeting the demands of the system, these leaders have become hollowed out. Like they have forgotten, they have lost connection to their own bodies, to their own sense of purpose. They've spent too much time meeting the demands of the system, right? And so on the Salmon River, we help rebuild that connection. We help we help people just completely disconnect. Like it's 5 days without a phone. There's no cell phone service on the river. We do not allow people to bring cell phones on the river. And they drop into story and they drop into these big questions that confront leaders with their agency. Like, yes, the last 5 years has made tremendous demands on you, but why is it important that you're here right now? Right? Or like questions like, what is the no that you have been postponing in your life? Right? These leaders are answering these questions in small groups of three as the Salmon River flows by. They're on the beach at 7:30 in the morning after having breakfast and coffee. The tears start flowing and the emotions start running and the joy starts happening. And by day 2 on the river, they are like children. They are experiencing joy again for the first time in years. And many of these heads have been doing their job for 10, 15, even 20 years. During these 3 days, they come up with a purpose statement that is revelatory for them, or at least helps them confirm what they've always known about themselves. And, my purpose statement is I forge paths so that goodness prevails. So you can see there that my gift is forging paths and my impact is so that goodness prevails. And that's what I think purpose is. It's like, how do you use your gifts? I call that the inner journey to see ourselves clearly in order to have an impact. And that's the outer journey to use our gifts to have impact, right? And so these heads of school this past week came up with purpose statements like, I climb the tree so others can see the view. I remove obstacles so that others can be free, right? And it's liberating because I think a good purpose statement can help you build a very coherent and stable story about yourself. For instance, in my case, as a journalist, I forged paths. As a child exploring paths in the woods, I forged paths. And now as a social entrepreneur, I'm forging paths, right? And the way that I use my gifts is that I want goodness to prevail. I want there to be harmony, right? That's sort of who I am. And that was for me ultimately why journalism was not a great fit for my strengths, because I was forging paths. I mean, I would write these big stories and I would get other media outlets to follow them. but it was too much fighting, too much antagonism. I needed something that was more solutions oriented, harmonious. It took me a while to figure it out. And when I was 40, I came up with that purpose statement. And everything made sense. The other thing a purpose statement can do is in the moment, in the present moment, it can help us remember who we are. So when we're under a threat or a challenge, or someone is telling a story about us or a stereotype that's not true, this is so true for leaders of color, for instance, that that they're facing these sort of assumptions all the time. And like remembering your purpose statement can be very affirmative in the moment. There's this amazing video from Amanda Gorman, who is the Youth Poet Laureate of the United States of America. And she gave the inauguration speech for President Biden. And in an interview after that speech, she's talking to Anderson Cooper of CNN. And Anderson Cooper is like, I mean, he's like, how do you get up there in front of tens of millions of people and do something like this? And she's like, well, Anderson, I have this mantra that I say every time I get on stage. And her mantra is something like, something to the effect of, I'm not going to get it perfectly, but she's like, and she uses her hands when she says it, which is so powerful because you see her using this mantra to like anchor back into her own body. She's like, I am the daughter of freedom fighters who broke their chains to free me. They call me, right?
Wow.
She says that, she drops into her body, and then she gets up on stage. And if you saw that poem she read, The Hill We Climb, it was a stunning performance from a 20-year-old Black woman who has, grew up in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Los Angeles, single mom, and had a serious speech impediment that she'd worked years to overcome. And in that video, she talks about the power of her ancestry and her community, which I think is so interesting because in the United States, in my culture, sort of white American culture, so often when people are having a crisis of meaning, their reaction is, oh, I need to meditate, I need to eat better, I need to get more exercise, I need to journal more, whatever. But I think what Amanda Gorman is telling us, and I think what Black America knows, is that the answer is community, right? If you want more purpose, yes, there are things you can do that will, good living and all that stuff is helpful. But ultimately, purpose is an individual journey that's different for everyone, but it can only happen in a community that is supportive, safe, loving. And Amanda Gorman shows us that if we want more purpose in life, the answer is oftentimes join a community, give back, help others, right? That was a little bit of a tangent, but we can learn so much from studying leaders, which is the premise of the work that World Leadership School does, is putting students in front of inspiring leaders. The third thing that a purpose statement can do for us is it can help us navigate the future. I'm not sure, for instance, what I'll be doing in 10 or 15 years, but I do know that I'll be forging paths so that goodness prevails. Like, I know that about myself now. And so when a teacher is asked to become a dean, and a dean is asked to become a division director, and division director is asked to become assistant head and head of school, whatever, knowing your purpose statement really helps people make a decision about their path, right? About understanding, okay, this is what the system is asking me. This is what I need to do. How can I figure this out so that these two things match up?
So you've talked about how the purpose statement then helps make decisions. It helps people become more resilient and deal with stressful situations. And you've also mentioned more in your biography about how leaders with purpose instill trust within their teams. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. To me, if we imagine someone who we trust completely, and then you can imagine someone you've worked for, a leader who you have not trusted. The difference, I believe, is that people who we trust are people who we see completely, people who are not mysterious to us, who are very clear to us. And this gets into that idea of essence versus form that you mentioned, Karin, at the beginning in your introduction. This idea that we have this essence, right? This is the inner journey, this thread that follows us through our life. If you have a good friend from childhood who you now know as an adult, you can understand that thread. You can remember that child and you see that child in the adult, right? So it's like we have this essence, but then we have this form, how we show up in the world. And so good leaders find a way to stay open, stay human. And so their essence is coming through in the way they show up in their form, right? And when we have a tight fit between essence and form, when we are transparent, authentic, when there's not much that is mysterious or opaque about us, when people can see us clearly, then they will trust us. And this is also very applicable to teachers because it's the same thing for teachers. When teachers are open and they have a tight fit between essence and form, children trust them, feel safe in their classrooms, and they want to learn. They want to learn from these teachers.
Mm, great, thank you. All right, I'd love to see if Marie, if you have any questions for Ross. I have a feeling a lot has resonated with you. So, any comments, any thoughts about what Ross has mentioned so far?
Yes, a lot has resonated with me. I've been taking a lot of notes as well. And Karin and I have spent a lot of time talking about purpose and within schools. And something that I guess I was wondering about is in the work that I've done with Karin, a lot of the conversation around purpose has been personal, but I'm lucky in that I think I've always felt as an educator that the work that I get to do really aligns with what I love and my purpose. It took a long time to be able to articulate that, but I feel like that's something I've been able to do this school year. And going into a new community, your point about it being grounding to have clarity around your purpose really resonated with me. It also helps to be open when you're leaving a place that you love as well. One of the challenges, though, within schools, particularly coming into a new community, is when there are multiple purposes. And so, you spoke about polarity, but sometimes there's polarities within different members of the community. So, for example, the teachers, the board, the head of school, the students. And so I guess I'm wondering a little bit about what work you've done with leaders or with students or school communities around trying to bring together that power of community with individual purpose and that search for individual purpose, how
Mhm.
we reconcile those.
Right. I think that every school has a unique situation, and I think every leader is unique. And when leaders understand their deepest gifts and how they use those gifts to have impact, they can find a good fit for their purpose. And I was talking to a leader yesterday on the phone who was with me on the Salmon River and didn't feel like she had quite gotten her purpose statement. So we worked for about an hour, and by the end of it, we really nailed it. And what we realized is that she is someone who, I'm forgetting her exact purpose statement, but it was something to the effect of she shines fierce love so that we move through challenges. So she needs a particular type of school, right? And like she's probably not going to be happy running a school that is sort of like the challenge is just more like operational, right? I mean, she needs a good challenge, to really use her gifts adequately. And so I think that that applies to all teachers and leaders who are joining a school. Like, why is this particular community going to be a good fit for me? Because if you think about like, there's the what, like how we spend our time and energy, et cetera. And then there's the why, right? Like why we feel called to do this work in the first place. I think most people, when they're considering a new job, are mainly thinking about the what, right? Do I like the city? Is the pay good? Is the housing good? All those things are totally important. But I think we also have to think about what is it about this particular community that's calling me? How is it going to fit with my gifts? And I'm wondering, Marie, in your case, going from Azerbaijan to Munich in Germany is a big step. Why did you feel confident that this was the right school for you?
So interestingly, I made my decision really based on purpose, care less about the location. I mean, there's some practical elements to it, of course, but we had no intention of going back to Europe. But I was really inspired by the head of school and
Mm.
the vision around supporting student leadership and supporting students and finding their unique gifts. My purpose statement is that I'm a commitment to seeing the beauty and the worth and the beautiful humanity of everyone I meet and reflecting this back to them so that they see it and believe in it and share it for a better world. It's probably a bit long and wordy, but I think something that I found is that I don't particularly care, I guess, about the wordsmithing of it because it's
Yeah.
grounding for me. And so the mission of the school really aligned, and it felt exciting to join a school where my own personal purpose aligned very strongly with the mission of the school. And then I think a reality on the ground, though, for every school is that there are these bigger purposes, but then within each community, purpose can be unifying and it can be energizing and it can also be a little bit divisive. As you know, I guess it's a question about what you were saying earlier about helping everyone within a community to find their own path within the system of the school and then the larger systems that the school is a part of.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say that was a mic drop moment right there. I mean, Marie, the fact that you were able to say your purpose statement, right, is amazing. You're in the probably top 1% of educators. Like, if you ask most people, hey, why do you do this work? What drives you? And people are just, they'll take hours to answer that question and they may never give you a good answer, right? And so that was incredibly impressive. And the fact that you made your decision to go to Munich based on your purpose and the affinity you felt with that head of school's purpose and the mission of the school and the work that the school is committed to doing. I mean, that's just amazing. And it just shows me that you're going to have a very successful time at your school. So kudos, that's incredible. But Simon Sinek, who is a consultant with a lot of corporations and does a lot of purpose work, he's written, best-selling books like Find Your Why, et cetera. Simon Sinek does like big organizational work with corporations, and he talks about this concept he calls nested purpose. And it's this idea that like in a large organization, and certainly an international school, like yours is an example of this, right? There's this huge tree and there's the mission of the organization, but then there's all the branches, all the departments, right? In an international school, people are constantly flowing into the system and flowing out of the system. Teachers are coming in, coming out every couple of years, students are leaving. And so it becomes really important that the system works well. And so the idea of nested purpose is like, if the school's like a tree and each department is like a branch, then the team in each branch has their own little nest. And so the admissions department could have their own sort of sense of purpose as a tree. It doesn't compete with, but it fits within the ecology of the mission of the organization. So it may feel as if it's at cross purposes at times, but if we adopt systems thinking and we think about how all these little parts contribute to the whole, then we begin to see the bigger picture. And not to say that conflict won't happen. I don't think you get change without conflict. I think conflict is a totally necessary part of organizational life. I think we all know that.
I'm familiar with Simon Sinek's work, but I don't recall actually the visual of the tree and that idea of nested purpose. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting to consider that idea of nested purpose when we're thinking about the systems that students are dealing with. So a real focus of conversation in international schools has been around how we support students and having pathways that fit their first mountain, right? Instead of a single pathway that everyone takes, the IB diploma, and then an alternative pathway that has traditionally been seen as lesser. And so I think it's a big conversation and one that schools need to be having, but it's difficult because you run into conflicting purposes around the purpose of a secondary school education, whether that's simply preparation for university and you can figure out who you are and what your purpose is later, or whether a secondary school or a middle school or primary school for that matter are the places where we have a responsibility to help students find who they are and that it has that magic, beautiful power that you were talking about earlier. And so I'm curious, I want to think a little bit more about what that concept of nested purpose might look like within the pathways that we offer for students so that they feel like they have real choice.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you landed on the key word: choice, voice, agency. Right now with the diploma program, the International Baccalaureate is, I think, one of the most beautiful systems It's so well designed. If you look at the educational goals, the mission of it, you cannot fail to be impressed. Now, does the diploma program have problems? Does it cause students extreme anxiety? Absolutely. And you think about that polarity again, and you think about the diploma program, right? The diploma program is purely, for many students, it feels like just meeting the demands of the system all the time, the extended essay, all those things that they have to do. And I don't think that we're going to get rid of the diploma program, but I do think that we can change it incrementally to integrate more agency. And I know that there's been, at the international school in Budapest, I think has been doing some really excellent work around this new idea called the innovation diploma. Interestingly, they're doing it outside the diploma program, which I think is an interesting move. How can we make those three key parts of the diploma program, the CAS, extended essay, and the theory of knowledge course, how can we make those things one thing that is driven by student agency, have students bring more agency to that core? If we could figure that out, the International Baccalaureate Diploma program would be the premier educational platform in the world. If we can actually have students engaging fully in things that they really care about and are given the opportunity to go really, really deep and do extraordinary work, that's amazing. I have two kids who are both in university now, and one of my son's most important things that ever happened to him in his educational career was when he was 14 or 13, he had a capstone program at his middle school, and they allowed him to do a project of his choice, and he engaged in that project. It was designing an earth shelter, which is studying earth shelters, which are these buildings that are partially covered by earth that are very sustainable. And he just loved it. He gave a final presentation at the end of the year. And guess what? 6 years later, he's at a university studying architecture. And it was that project, that capstone project, when he was 13 or 14, that led him to where he is today.
Yeah, great examples, Ross. I have a similar one with my daughter also, she's still younger, but I think the one thing she engaged in most was actually her after school activity where she could design a research around water. They could choose the topic, and so she chose microplastics. And I have never seen her spend so much time learning everything about microplastics and trying to think of a solution, trying to come up with, well, if we put it in the ocean and create a filter, and she was doing science and art and design and, all together, and math. And this was all voluntary on top of the school work. It wasn't even like a capstone project she had to do. It was just after school activity.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and I think another point that you have brought up, not in this talk with us yet, but I think it's important to highlight, is the importance of doing this purpose work early on related to the mental health crisis, because that's something else
Yes.
you've also talked about. The mental health crisis, especially amongst our youth, is a lot around meaninglessness.
Yeah.
What would you say is the relationship then between purpose and agency? What you talked about, right? Students
Hmm.
finding agency, like your son, my daughter, in their learning and mental health.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, just to be clear, there's a huge mental health crisis for youth. There's also a mental health crisis for teachers and for school leaders. We are seeing our retention rate on heads of school. The average turnover now in the United States, at least, is 2 or 3 years. And it is a huge problem for our organizations because it is so expensive to replace a head of school, so time consuming, and the school just sort of stands still during that search process, right? And so there's a mental health crisis going on throughout school. And I think that when you think about purpose, being connected to your body, being connected to your gifts gives you resilience, right? And, researchers have shown that adults and youth who work and learn with a sense of purpose are more likely to experience a challenge as invigorating rather than debilitating. Researchers have a term for that. They call it eustress, or in other words, good, like EU stress, right? Good stress. And, World Leadership School, we have mapped, based on the research that's been done at Stanford University's Center on Adolescence, which was for many years led by Bill Damon. Bill Damon divides students into these like four buckets, right? There's like the goal-driven students who are just completely following the demands of a system. There are the dreamers, he calls them, who are really connected to themselves internally, but are not really showing up in the world. They're connected to their own voice, but they're not really feeling a sense of agency out in the world. There's the disengaged ones who are neither working hard nor really connected to themselves. And then there's finally the purposeful students. And at World Leadership School, we never really liked the idea of these 4 buckets. And so we instead created this XY graphic. And just try to visualize this, but if you had the X axis was activity and the Y axis was meaning, purposeful students are high in activity and high in meaning. In other words, they're connected to their gifts and they're using those gifts to have impact. So I think what happens is that our schools, especially these international schools that have these high-powered diploma programs and IB courses, most of their students are in that goal-driven category. And when you're in that goal-driven category for too long, you run the risk of becoming hollowed out, right? Of really becoming burnt out. And I think many high school students all around the world in high school, after working so hard, they reach a point where they say, why am I working so hard? What is this all about? And it's a very painful question that leads to anxiety, it leads to depression, it leads to all these negative things we're seeing. If we think about this graphic, the last thing I'll say is just for my own kids, this graphic was really important because I feel like my son was very goal-driven in high school, and he needed different interventions to get him into more of a meaningful quadrant. He needed to have his bubble burst emotion, things that sort of brought him out of his bubble, right? My daughter, what I would consider in high school, was more of a dreamer. She had a lot of meaning and passion and voice, but when she went into school, she kind of shut down in school. And so she, on the other hand, needed things like coaching, mentors, action plans. She had this really solid core and she needed help stepping out and using those gifts in school. By being a little more sophisticated about purpose, we can find the interventions that each child needs, like thinking more like a coach and coaching students, being a detective, helping kids understand their purpose, and then coaching them specifically with interventions that help them get what they need to move into that purpose quadrant.
Well, Ross, I think we could talk for another hour about this. It's so interesting, and you bring incredible experience to the conversation. And so I want to thank you for sharing your stories, your wisdom, and everything that you do for schools and the educational world. I think it's phenomenal. Big thank you to joining me today. I really appreciate it. And Marie as well, for your powerful questions. I think you being an educator in the field now it's so helpful to bring in the content and those bigger questions that for me, I'm now outside of the school system, is more challenging for me to do. But so thank you both for this, very inspiring, valuable conversation. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Karin. And Marie, it was great to meet you.
Thank you, Ross. It was really great to meet you as well. Yeah, I think I have a million more questions and a little bit more research to do. So thank you. It's a energizing kind of way to find myself in the middle of the summer. So
Good.
thank you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Al.
you.
All right.
If you know of any leaders who are keen to find their purpose and want to work on their purpose statement, feel free to put them in contact with me, and I'd love to have a conversation with them. Take care. Bye.